Essentially, he had two of his sons he blessed because they did something that he approved of. One of his sons he cursed because he did something that he was offended by. You can go read that in Genesis. It's kind of a weird, silly story, but at that time, I guess that was a big deal. And so apparently this is what happened, and it kind of makes me believe that you look at the world as a whole today and you see there are nations that are prospering and that are doing well. Then there are nations that do pretty good. And people live there, things are going well, they have a living and land and uh, all different types of things that a typical society has. Then there are a few countries that are third world countries that are impoverished. They don't have much. And it's 2025 and they're still living the way that, people might have lived 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And it boggles the mind because you think, how could this be possible that we live in a world today where we're going into AI, robotics, cryptocurrency, and all these like super technological things? And you still have people that don't even have drinking water near them. You still have people that have to walk 10 miles a day round trip to go get clean drinking water. All right, everybody, back with another one. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a continuation of the Noah's Ark story, trying to connect the dots to sort of break down, exactly what happened from the days of Noah and the flood and where it actually, led humanity to sort of where we are today. I know that that can be a kind of confusing concept to understand, and sometimes some stuff from the Bible to your average non-believer could sound very like mythical or, ridiculous, but there are ways to actually tie the stories in the Bible into actual history and can be backed up with historical evidence, archaeological evidence, discoveries, actual finds and things like that. So, we're not obviously going to get into, all of that today in one, podcast episode even. It would take, years to go through everything throughout, thousands of years of time and the generations and how they, landed where, we are today, how everything breaks up. But I wanted to sort of just dive a little bit into exactly what happened from Noah's Ark and the rebuilding of humanity and just sort of show you that the idea that one family or group of families repopulated the earth and how that actually all went down is a real thing, and that we are all technically connected. We are all technically family on some level going back in time, whether you go back to Adam and Eve or you go back to Noah and that family. We are all pretty much connected, by blood also, but by, genetic line as well. And we're not all connected in the sense that we have the exact same, genetics, because we'll go into it and break down, Noah and his sons, and their wives repopulated the earth. So there are, you know, genetic differentiations there with the wives of each of Noah's sons not being related to each other. As far as we know, we don't know 100% sure, but as far as we know, that's the case. So, not everybody is full blood, connected on all sides, but we are all connected by the same family, the same, bloodline on the father's side, Noah. And so it's a hard concept, but it's really not spoken about much. I don't really think it's taught in the schools. I don't really think it's even taught much in, churches or in religious schools, and different types of religious schooling that's, not like going to a Catholic or a Christian elementary or high school or something, but going to like extracurricular religious schools. I don't really think they teach these things, but if they did, there might not be as much, not that there wouldn't totally, but as much, maybe fighting in the world if and wars and things like that if we stressed the idea that we all came from the same family of people. And so we're all technically supposed to look at each other like we're brothers and sisters because we actually all are. And God even refers to, humanity that way throughout the entire Bible, Christians and pre-Christian people were sort of referred to as brothers. That was for multiple things. It was on a spiritual level, but on a physical level, biological level as well. So we'll get into that, we'll dive into that, and we'll take a look at a non-religious historical piece of, document, if you want to call it that, that sort of corroborates a lot of this information that you can actually find in the Bible. It sort of, agrees with it and, helps continue to paint the picture as well. Now, obviously, what I'm going to show you is non-biblical in the sense that I don't think that it was created by people who are declared Christians. I think it was just a organization that does these type of, documents, and this just happens to be one of them. But it's good because it shows, we when we go throughout, archaeological finds, or we go throughout the history books throughout time, if you put enough of them together, they're all pieces of a puzzle. And almost always you'll have, if it goes back far enough and things like that, almost always it'll give you another piece of evidence that backs up something that's already in the Bible. So it really is quite interesting how, the stuff that's in the Bible is so true. And there are things today that are still being, discovered or worked out, the minds get together, the educators, the archaeologists, the historians, and they agree on, something, that they thought was one thing, but they decided it's something else, and it, agrees with something that's in the Bible. So, not to be long winded, but really, I think we're getting closer and closer to a time where we have hard evidence of what's in the Bible because a lot of it is, you know, evidence. There is evidence, but there's not enough hard evidence other than some of the things that, were discovered, most of which was scriptures, the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that, where they date them back thousands of years, but still it's just words on a page. When we find actual things in life, that connect to what there is in the written word of the Bible, it just makes it that much more believable. And for a world filled with non-believers, sometimes you do need hard evidence to convince people because, when you're not coming from the mindset or the spirit of what God has put in us, especially as Christians who learn to think that way, you sometimes need to see and feel the real thing in order for you to believe it, for something to just click in your mind or your heart. And I've mentioned this recently with the Noah's Ark discovery, where the people who are doing this dig on Mount Ararat in Turkey truly believe that they possibly found Noah's Ark. Then there was also, it's going around social media, the Göbekli or Beckley Tepe archaeological find, and I sort of connected the dots on the last episode, or the one before this actually, painting the picture that that might have been an altar that Noah created, built, and, his sons for God. Why I believe that theory is, because of the location, because of the time period, and, because of the fact that a lot of the sculptures or engravings in the stones at the temple were of animals, which basically looks as though a person was trying to tell a story that had to do with animals. And when you go back that far, there's really only one thing that we can think of that would possibly be, you know, a story that was massive enough that needed to be told, where somebody built a giant, stone temple and hand carved into it all these pictures of animals. Why would somebody do that thousands of years ago and work that hard at that, especially in a time where every day you're fighting to survive. It's not like today where you click a button and, food gets delivered to your house and you have, shelter and heat and all these things. Back then they every day was survival. So why would you spend that much time dedicating it towards something that, risks your survival if it wasn't the most important thing for you to do at that moment? And the only thing big enough that I could think of at that time is, the Great Flood, right? So I've made these connections, but you can, you'll see a lot more of that in future episodes. I'll try and dive into a little bit of it today where I connect some of those dots, but even further. But it's hard for people to believe that, the story of Noah's Ark and that this really happened. But just to recap it, I will, and then we'll go into everything in the episode that we can fit in, and then whatever else we'll try and fit in future episodes because there's a lot to unpack with this, and some of it's theory, but some of it's more along the lines of fact. At least from what the evidence that we have. So we'll try and unpack a bit, as much of it as we can in this episode, but we'll probably have to break up into multiple episodes. So we'll talk about all of those things in just a moment. Before I do that, I want to definitely talk about the previous episode that we did with our special guest Anthony Volpe. We had a great conversation, talked about a lot of topical things because I try to integrate different topics in this channel where, some of it's, what's on the news in the current moment, current events, some of it's political, politics, although I try to always do that because we're not just a politics channel. We're not a one topic or one category channel. We try to diversify and talk about as many different things as we can, or at least the things that I'm interested in or knowledgeable about. And then I can bring my perspective as well as whatever guests we have on can bring theirs if it's something that I'm not. But we had, Anthony on, we talked about some topical, events, some current events that were happening. And it's pretty big stuff. So definitely check out the episode. That was episode, I think it was episode 107, if I'm not mistaken, was the last one. And then the one before that was the one where we dove a little bit more into the theory of, Noah's Ark being connected to Göbekli Tepe. So if you want to check that out, it should be episode 106, the one right before this. Previous one with Anthony Volpe. And yeah, just take, definitely take a look at the stuff that we're putting out because we're trying to go more in depth with these things. We're trying to offer, stuff that hopefully most of the internet is not offering. And even if some of it seems along the lines of like conspiracy theory, it's more of a deep dive into, whatever the theory is, but backing it up with as much facts as we can and the resources of where to go find that information so you don't just blindly believe me, but mostly to not just be like a conspiracy channel where we, talk about whatever, you know, trending conspiracy is happening, but instead dive into something that's really quite interesting that a lot of people aren't talking about, hopefully, and connect it to something bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with future episodes until this massive puzzle or picture is created. Because another big thing I think I want this channel to be, and this is something I'm sort of feel led to tell you or do, but essentially it's to be like the mosaic of the internet, or at least have something to do with that. I haven't really gotten a clear understanding of what the whole picture is, but that's sort of what I understand is taking pieces of everything that's out there and trying to compile it into a big picture. And so that's just sort of the word that I got if you want to, say that. I'm not a prophet or anything, so I'm not part of that camp of people on the internet who have those type of channels. Just something that sometimes I feel led in a certain direction, so I just go with that direction. And that's on my own personal spiritual journey with Christ and my beliefs as a Christian. But I feel that it's something to do with that, the mosaic of the internet. But I will talk more about that in future episodes when I have more clarity on it. For now, we'll get into that stuff. Last thing I want to do is just mention to check out the book, my book, the book that I wrote, Little Boy Full of Love. This is a children's book. So it's obviously not, like a novel or anything. It's not for everybody, but it is a legitimate book. It has a barcode, ISBN number, publisher, and It is available on all the major, book platforms, barnesandnoble.com, walmart.com, amazon.com, Indigo, which spans both America and Canada, and bookshop.org, and a whole bunch of other, websites. But more important for me, at least because I value small businesses and I think that, we need to support them, is it's actually in several bookstores throughout the country. We're in over 20 states, I believe now, and the physical book is in those bookstores. So the bookstores that it's in can be found on my Instagram profile page, whatever, and you can see which ones are closest to you because the addresses and everything are on there. And my recommendation is to go and support a local business by going and buying the physical book at their bookstore. But if there's not one near you, that's okay. You could order it online. Just something that I recommend. I know that we're no longer in the holiday season, so obviously there might not be many reasons to buy the book right at this moment. But if you know somebody that has a birthday coming up, a person, your family or a friend that has a young child, it's a great book. Has a lot of really good life wisdom that I put in there, made for children, but also could be applied to just life in general as adults as well. It's a great book. It's got great reviews online, and it's a lot of people do like it, and they hopefully it's something different that is not really that common today and not really on the market. So it's not like just another book like that. It's hopefully a little different. But it's a great book. Definitely pick it up if you're interested in that. Check out all of our other stuff. We have an ad at the end of each video, so it tells you about all the stuff that we have because we're self-funded, independent channel. So if you want to support the channel, purchase the products that really help support the channel the most. And don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, share, all that good stuff because it keeps things going. All right, let's jump into it. So I'm going to show a visual in a moment where we could dive a little bit deeper into this, but we're going to start with the story of Noah. So just to recap that, if you haven't read Genesis, the story of Noah and Genesis, which I think a lot of people, they know the story, right? Because it was a verbal story that was told orally a lot back then before it actually made it into, scripture and then became part of the Bible book. But for a long time, it was a story that was told, orally. We just used to tell it to each other, our ancient ancestors before we had written language. So it goes back. It's one of the oldest stories that goes back throughout time, and because it was such a massive story too, because it was such a big event that happened in world history. So every culture has a flood story, but they're all telling the same flood story. They're just telling it slightly different based on how their ancestors told it to them. So, you know, we all know the story is Noah built an ark. He went on the ark with his family and some animals, and then they survived the flood, and then they went off and just went on with their lives. I think that's sort of the general concept as to what most people know of as the Noah's Ark story. But there's more to it. So, with the recent discovery of this, possible ship buried in the top of Mount Ararat in Turkey, people believe that that might be Noah's Ark. So, the understanding is that Noah's ship landed on the top of Mount Ararat and is actually in the Bible. So it correlates with this situation that archaeologists are discovering now and still going through. The idea is that they left the ark because God told them to leave the ark, go off, and he went off, Noah and his family, and they built a temple and they, sacrificed animals to God, and it was basically an altar to God. This is all told in Genesis. After that, it goes on to tell the story of Noah's family and how they repopulated the earth. So Noah had three sons that he brought with him on the trip, and then also each of his sons had wives. So they were all married and ready to have families almost immediately after the flood, because that whole process took about a year. So after the flood, his sons Ham, Shem, and Japheth, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, had the children with their wives. Each of them had a genetic line that's broken down in Genesis, and it tells you the generations of each of their kids in Genesis 10. And it talks about how these families repopulated the earth and created nations, and how those nations eventually got built into what we know today as, I guess, pretty much, the major continents and countries that were inhabited at that time in that side of the world. And there's a story in there as well, which we won't go into now, but essentially, he had two of his sons he blessed because they did something that he approved of. One of his sons he cursed because he did something that he was offended by. You can go read that in Genesis. It's kind of a weird, silly story, but at that time, I guess that was a big deal. And so apparently, this is what happened. And it kind of makes me believe that you look at the world as a whole today and you see there are nations that are prospering and that are doing well. Then there are nations that do pretty good. People live there. Things are going well. They have a living and land and uh, all different types of things that a typical society has. Then there are a few countries that are third world countries that are impoverished. They don't have much, and it's 2025 and they're still living the way that, people might have lived 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And it boggles the mind because you think, how could this be possible that live in a world today where we're going into AI, robotics, cryptocurrency, and all these like super technological things? And you still have people that don't even have drinking water near them. You still have people that have to walk 10 miles a day round trip to go get clean drinking water so that they could just start their day. Or you have people who live in, huts or, shacks with tin roofs. And you think, how could this be possible that these people are living like this today with all the technology that we have? I mean, we could literally fly containers of water to these countries and plop them down right in the middle of the village. And they'd have clean drinking water for a year. Like we have gigantic drum containers that helicopters, giant military helicopters could fly. They do this with wildfires. They dump buckets of water, huge ones, on an entire wooded area to put out a fire. So we have all this technology, and you could say, yeah, it has to do with money and it has to do with, but people donate, people volunteer. There are ways to get that done. Why are these nations still struggling in the ways that they are? And it's specific nations that have been struggling forever. And you wonder, like, why have they never become prosperous in pretty much all of history, or they have moments in history where they were, but for long periods of time, they just could not get out of poverty or could not get out of a certain ideology or a certain, a cultural way of living. And it makes you think, or at least makes me think, do these countries stem back to the the son of Noah that he cursed? And is that connected to how, that entire genetic line? Because it talks about it in Genesis how Noah said he's going to curse not only his son, but his son's entire genetic line, all of his heirs. And so it makes you think that maybe it really did happen. Maybe Noah cursed his entire genetic line for that son. And the people that are still living today, you know, impoverished and in these countries where there's tyranny and there's, you know, just if you believe a certain thing, they'll come and cut your head off and all these like crazy things that you hear on the news. It makes you think how much of that or the stuff that we see today that's really bad goes back to the curse that Noah put on his son and his son's entire genetic line. So that's just a theory, but to me, I believe very seriously in that type of stuff because the Bible talks about this over and over again. It talks about blessings, it talks about curses, it talks about, so many things that people used to have to do to get a curse just lifted off of them. And then if another one got put on, that they do it again. And it's not witchcraft, it's not evil. I mean, curses are evil, but this stuff is also biblical. It's also in the Bible. It's also, God would tell people to do certain things to be blessed, sacrifice animals and all these things. Yeah, we don't do that stuff anymore because Christ came, but there are so many things that, are in the Bible in relation to this stuff. And so it just makes me think and wonder if a lot of this, it just goes all the way back to this one moment where Noah cursed his son and all of his genetic line. But anyway, Noah's three sons repopulate and they create, they have kids and then their kids have kids and their kids have kids. And it walks you through that in Genesis, starting from like Genesis 10 and going on to several other chapters. But they eventually become full nations of people because, one person had 10 kids and then that person had 10 kids. And, each one of those kids had, 3 to 10 kids. So before you know it, you do have like thousands of people. That's a city. That's a town or a city or whatever. And this is how they repopulated the earth. We'll get into that a little bit more, but we'll try our best to fit as much as we can in here today, and break it down. It's going to take a lot longer to really get through this, but we're going to look now at it's a timeline of 4,000 years of history going back to like 2000 BC to 2000 AD, which was just, 20 years ago. And we'll take a look at it now. We'll dive into it as much as we can and we'll get an idea as to what it is. But I'll tell you what I believe the name of it is, so you can go look it up yourself. This is one of the best timelines I've ever seen anybody put out. And not just because of, the context about it being historical. I like charts, I like data, I'm very analytical. This is such a detailed document. It must have took somebody or a team of people 1,000 hours to put this together because it really does encompass a lot of history, world history, and maps out each different tribe of people and how they all sort of, eventually led to the nations that we know of today. So we'll take a look at that now and then we'll dive into it. So this is called the Histo Map. It is 4,000 years of world history. If you've never seen this before, it is probably the most comprehensive compilation of history from all, the East and the West, going back 2,000 years BC and going all the way down to 2000 AD, which again, just like 20, 25 years ago, and showing how each group of people ended up from where they were 2000 BC to where we are today. Now we'll do a walkthrough of it as much as we can, but I highly recommend if you have a chance, go pull this thing up and read it yourself. It's really great and it's very accurate. I haven't found any mistakes yet. I found some um issues with where certain words are written in terms of the timeline and how, maybe it's a little off in terms of the years, but it's hard to pinpoint where they meant that. So I'm not going to fault them on it, but I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe this is put out by the Visual Capitalist, who they make a ton of stuff. I mean, I think all they do is make like charts and data, and it's great. They have a lot of great stuff on their website. But this is check it out on their website. I think it's 4,000 years of world history by the Visual Capitalist. So if you do want to look at this yourself, I highly recommend you do. It's a great document. And so this is the entire thing, which I'll scroll down now. We're starting from 2000 BC and we're going through all of this timeline. I mean, this is a very long document. You'd never be able to print this on one piece of paper. And it goes all the way to 2000 AD. So the year 2000, basically. Um, and this is how everything was broken down into the different nations today. So we'll just do a quick overview of it, just to give people an idea of what's on it, and then we'll talk about Noah's family line and how where they all ended up, and try and connect it as much as we can. It's so much to go through. We'd never be able to get through it all in one shot, but I'll try my best to sum it up as best I can. So essentially, you have the ancient I think it's pronounced Aegeans, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Iranians, the Indians, the Huns, and the Chinese. So these are the different cultures of people that go back to 2000 BC. And this talks about the different, things that were going on at that time, different groups of people, different major events. So this is just ancient civilizations. Now, from school, I think most people know of the Egyptians, the Hittites, Iranians, which we still, call the people in this part of the world that today, the Chinese, Indians, but there are other groups too, which the Hittites are not as common, but some people know them, the Aegeans and the Huns, and these all sort of go throughout history. So at this time you had, and we'll go into this much more in the future, we'll dive deep into these different civilizations and some of the stuff that was going on there. Because really, like I said in the past, the story of world history is really just two things. It's the story of God's creation of mankind and you know, their existence spread throughout the world, and then the coming of Jesus Christ, his arrival, his resurrection and death, and then his um leaving us behind the creation of Christianity. And so, the entire, people could sum up life or world history in just two things: God's creation of man and God's spread of Christianity throughout the world, because that story's still being written. So God's creation of man has already, begun, but the story of the spread of Christianity, literally, even just you can see it on this document and how it begins and how it starts to spread and how still an ongoing story. And it talks about it even in Revelation that, Christ will not come back again until his message, which is Christianity, is spread to all four corners of the earth. So we know, um, the world ends with everybody hearing Christianity and getting a chance to hear the gospel and Jesus' story and have an opportunity to become a Christian and give their life to Christ. So all of life is about that. It's about, you look at the Bible, it's broken up into two things really: the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the story of the coming of Jesus, and the New Testament is the story of Jesus came and the aftermath and the spread of Christianity. So it's really quite interesting, but that is literally what life is in a nutshell. But you can see here, all of these different civilizations that we know, we've learned in school, we've heard of them, and how it breaks down. So early on, you had the Egyptian Empire. This was like, Pharaoh, and you see like the movies and you hear all that stuff about like, um these were really ruthless people at that time. They would freaking, mummify you, wrap you in like gauze and stuff and bury you alive and, do all these crazy things because they didn't know God. These people, were part of what we'll talk about in a minute, the civilization of people that were cursed. Um, you had the Amorites, which led to the Babylonian kingdom. If you don't know about ancient Babylon, um, you know, there's so many stories of it that are outside of the Bible. There's stories of, civilizations who talked about this place, Babylon, and how it was this great place and how people were rich. And it was the first city or nation of people in history where people were massively wealthy. And, um, the whole concept of a lot of the things that we know of about money today, lending, debt, interest rates, it comes from Babylon. And, there's even a great book called The Richest Man in Babylon. I forget the name of the author, but it's an old book. It's like 100 years old. And it's a great book. Has a lot of, maybe one day I'll do it as one of the book reviews, parallels, and talking about back in Babylonian times and what these people did and, the life lessons that, one person who was rich taught another person who was poor and how it made that person rich. And it's just a great, um, you know, book, but it's got nothing to do with the Bible. It's not a religious book. It's just a book from, it's like a business book or a self-help book. And, it talks about this ancient civilization, Babylon, who come from the Amorites, that whole, genetic line of people. You've got, which we still call and know of today, but these were the early ones, Iranians, Indians, the Huns, which would eventually become the Mongolians, which if you don't know about the Mongolian Empire, you'll maybe learn about that in school if you're young, but if not, it was a big part of history. I remember learning about it in school, I think both in high school and college. And then the Chinese, who we still know of today. Um, but this breaks down all the different empires. You had the Egyptian Empire, which was the biggest empire at that time. Um, the Babylonians were the richest, but the Egyptians were the biggest and the most powerful at that time. They were the first, like, really massive empire. And then you had, all these other empires that eventually led into other empires. Out of this whole location, geographical, but also cultural people. You had the Hittites, you had the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and then out of that, and the Iranians, and it birthed the Hebrews, which came about 1500 BC. And you have that split into so many different things, which was the Hebrews, the Jews, the Phoenicians, which is talked about a lot in the Bible, the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire. Like, these were major parts of not only biblical uh history, but also non-biblical history, where we recognize and identify these groups of people. But after the Egyptians, you had the Babylonians, you had the Assyrians. These nations had major empires that were huge, and at the time, basically ruled the world, quote unquote. I mean, they ruled as much land as they could in the areas that they could reach. Some people were out of reach from those areas. Like, I think China, the Chinese people, and the Huns were sort of like doing their own thing, and not really fall victim to as much of the stuff that went on in the Middle East and west of that, because they were so far geographically, but they still found ways to connect with each other. Like, that's what the whole Silk Road thing was. They set up trade routes with each other, and did cooperate and communicate with each other. But yeah, it's really quite interesting. History itself is interesting. But you had the Assyrian Empire, and then eventually if you look back up here, you had the Iranians that went down and eventually became the Persians, which the Persian Empire was a big empire. The Persian Empire is, if I'm not mistaken, if you've ever seen the movie 300, that was um, I think it was Leonidas and his people, who were the Spartans. They were the toughest military ever in world history. Every soldier, every person, their entire life was, about being in in their military, the Spartans. And they were the toughest, they were the strongest, they were the most in shape. They could defeat anybody in hand-to-hand combat. Um, but in the movie, they fought this large army, and the story was that the 300, won the big battle against the great army, and they took out way more people than they had. And then eventually they got killed with the next wave because it was even bigger and there was less of them because some of them died in battle. But that's a famous story of the Spartans who, stood up to this large army. That was the Persians. The Persians were the army that, they fought, and they um, lost the battle, but they won the war. And the Persian army ruled for a long time. And then you had the Greeks. The Greeks came around. Well, we all know about the Great Greek Empire. That's when, like, philosophy and all that type of deep thought came out of, was the Greeks, and for a while the Greeks ruled the world. For a while, you had they had control over, many different locations that were not part of what we know as modern day Europe today. But at the time you had Alexander the Great, you had all these big people who were super powerful, and the technology was changing, the weapons were getting better, they were using different types of metal, they were using different types of metal for the armor, which made them stronger and more able to resist other militaries that had less powerful weapons because they were using the older metals that, people first started mining when civilizations were, established. So you had, the Greek Empire, and that whole era. You had, other smaller empires, the Parthian and things like that, but they weren't as powerful. And then we get into the Roman Empire, which was the biggest, most massive, powerful empire ever in world history. And I think geographically, they had control over more locations than any other empire um, for the longest period of time up until Great Britain and that empire, and then America. But for the longest time, the Romans were the biggest empire. They ran things for 1,000 years practically, and they were just massive in size and scope. And everybody knows about the ancient Roman Empire. You had some of these other empires that popped up. Um, but then, obviously we go throughout time, we go how everything starts to break up into different civilizations. The Roman Empire fell, it became the Byzantine Empire, and other things like that. But then over here, you have, this whole yellow trail right here goes all the way up from the Huns. And they basically really were not like a massive civilization of people, but they were, big in their side of the world. And it wasn't until, right around AD, the first, 400 years BC, um, right before we get to the turn of the, you know, new way we look at time, no longer BC but AD because of Christ. And right on that side of the world, the Far East, China and Mongolia and those parts of the world, you had the Mongolian Empire. It was, Attila the Hun and all this, like, if you ever learned about that stuff in school. And so they were a big empire. They had a lot of power and influence, and they had, tough warriors. And so, you know, again, like every nation, it rises and falls. You can see it throughout time, but it actually the visual of this on the chart is cool because you see the nation just, spread, 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 get bigger, get more powerful, have more jurisdiction, and then fall over time. And it could be 500 years or 1,000 years, but it's interesting to see how they all eventually fall and go away. And we have everything going down throughout time. And then, right around here, 500 AD, you have um, the Muhammad and the Muslims, the Arabs, all these different cultures of people who came from like the Persians, how they founded this religion of Islam, which would, continue on to what we see today. And it all pretty much came out of the Persian, roots of ancient civilization that led to this time period of AD. And people still practice Islam today. You had also too, like even over here on the China side, you have so many different dynasties that we've heard throughout, history. Like there were some really amazing, big dynasties that were powerful. Obviously we all know about Mao, we all know about who's that other big one? It's like drawing blanks right now. Yeah, well there's a lot of different drawing a blank right now, but huge, huge powerful leader on that side of the world, and Genghis Khan. Oh, that was what it was. Who apparently he had himself like 100 kids or 1,000 kids or whatever it was, and you know, you have all these different civilizations that keep spreading and fracturing and breaking off and going into other nations and all this stuff and just really quite interesting history. You had the Franks, you had the Goths, you had um uh the Holy Roman Empire with the Crusades, you had the Byzantine Empire, as we talked about, the Mongolians, and then all these nations eventually fractured off in the 1,000 years after Christ, where we get to like 1000 AD, and we start moving into the Middle Ages and the Viking era, then the Middle Ages, and then all these different time periods. It's really cool once you dig deep into all this stuff. But then eventually, these nations start forming, and you have Sweden, France, Spain, Scotland, Ireland, Holland. England, all these different nations, and down here you have this big thing is the Great British Empire, and they ruled the world. It looks a lot smaller because there were so many nations that fractured off of all these old empires, there were just so many. But Great Britain was the biggest, most powerful nation at that time, and had ever been before them. And then America came around, and America's been the most powerful since everybody else. And it's just crazy how like the nations, they get bigger, more powerful, but there's more of them today. So we don't. America is just America. We have a huge landmass. This country, the continent of the United States, we have the biggest military, strongest, most powerful, but we haven't conquered a lot of land. Yeah, we go in and do nation building and things like that, which we shouldn't do. Um, but we haven't gone around the world and conquered, nations and took the land as ours, and put the America stamp on every one of them. America's just the United States, the continent of the United States, and Alaska and Hawaii. We have some commonwealths, some provinces, some, territory that's part of us, but they're not part of our country. They don't have constitutional rights. They don't have all these backing and protections that we have if you're actually in America. These other nations, their footprint was on huge land masses, spanning much more distance than America, and having control over so many that even if they didn't have control over other nations, they had influence in them. So people did live by their law, even though they were their own country. It's not like that anymore. There's 200 countries in the world, and whatever it is, 192, whatever, and you know, America's just one of them, you know? So this is the Histo map. It's a really interesting document if you ever have a chance to really, really read through it. You probably can't see it that well because it's a little blurry. I have it zoomed in so that you could see all this stuff, because otherwise, if we zoom out, it looks like this, and it's really hard to see. But we have it like that so that we can read it. But yeah, let's jump into. So we won't really talk too deeply about Noah and the descendants of each, but you can read that in Genesis chapter 10, where it really breaks down, Japheth, his heirs were the Japhites, Ham's children were the Hamites, which just called these nations. And then Shem's children were the Semites, which we all understand today as being the Jews, being the ones that went off to found those lands in the Middle East that would eventually become, Israel, modern day Israel, but also, ancient Israel with, Nazareth and Bethlehem and all those, geographical locations. And it's, really quite interesting because there's so much history to unpack in that. But, you have, like, for example, Ham was the one who was cursed by Noah, and he's the one whose descendants went on to, do all this stuff. And one of his descendants was Nimrod, and Nimrod went on to, basically, establish, Assyria and build Nineveh. And if you know your Bible, you know the story of Nineveh, the story of, Jonah, who when God called him to go off and tell the people of Nineveh to repent for their sins because they were living really wickedly, and they did. They turned away from, they turned back to God and away from their sin. It's just all these like really interesting little stories that you can unpack in the Bible that talk about these geographical locations where people lived and thrived and built these, cities and everything. And it all goes back to, all of this. I mean, obviously further because life is further back than just 2000 BC. But this is where you really start to see like nations forming and really getting to cities and people living thousands upon thousands collectively in a not a large geographical area, which we basically established today as cities. But before that, it was just really people spread throughout. areas, or if there were cities, they were much smaller. It was very, you know, less groups of people that lived there. This timeline is when it's really a lot clearer for historians to be able to say this is what we know for sure because there was already writing documentation. Hieroglyphs were invented like the 3000s. You had cuneiform, and that led to hieroglyphics, which the Egyptians created, and that led to writing, which eventually led to the ability to put the stories of the Bible down on paper, which would become the scriptures. So it all kind of took like 1,000 years or so to get to that point. And that's when you got the story of the flood on paper. And they'll tell you, oh yeah, every culture had a flood story. No, they were all telling the same flood story, but they were telling it as opposed to writing it because writing wasn't invented yet. Then they invented like cuneiform hieroglyphs where they started making visuals with images that they created, and that represented a word or a letter or whatever. And that eventually led to us being able to take the story of the flood and put it on paper. And just because that scripture was written X amount of years after people were telling the story of the flood in a certain location doesn't mean it's not the same story. It just means it took them that long to be able to figure out how to write and then put it down on paper. Um, but yeah, you have all these, different groups of people, and, we will basically try and pinpoint what, who those people were. But Shem and his line were the most blessed. They were the ones that Noah really decided were his basically, like, not in so many words, but essentially his favorite son, and he was the one that was going to be extra blessed. Japheth was blessed too, and so were his heirs. Um, Ham was the only one that was cursed, and his heirs were cursed. But Shem was the one that was really special. He's the one that would go on, and God would create a covenant with his people. And so when you go down Shem's line, you eventually get to Abraham. And Abraham was the first person that God really made a covenant with. I mean, he did make certain covenants with certain people, but Abraham was the first one that he really made a covenant with, um, to bless and build a nation from. And so Abraham was the one who God, said, you will be the one that eventually, the Christians will come from, you know, and before the Christians, the Jews. And so it was all a linear trail leading from Shem, Noah's son, that went to Abraham, and then Abraham, and then he had his family line who, his sons were Ishmael and Isaac, and we all know Isaac is the one that God chose to create his covenant with. And so, he had Isaac, and then out of Isaac came his sons, one of which being Jacob, who would go on to create the 12 tribes of Israel. So there you have the direct line from Noah to Israel was essentially Shem, Noah's son, who was one of the three or four men that were on the earth after the flood. No one else had existed. It was just those four men, Noah and his three sons. And he went on to, go down the line, have Abraham, have Isaac, have Jacob. And Jacob was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So you have all this stuff where it led to all these different, groups of people. And then out of Israel came, you know, the Jews, and then eventually Jesus, and then eventually the Christians. And that's where it all goes back to is Shem, the son of Noah. And so we won't be able to pinpoint all of this today because it just take too long. But when we look at just these groups of people, the Aegeans, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Iranians, the um, Indians, the Huns, and the Chinese, we really understand that um, it breaks down this way. Japheth's family line, because he had many more children, I believe, than the rest, spread wide, encompassed a lot of these different groups of people because his family split up so far. Ham's family was the ones that were cursed. and they really more built and industrialized things a lot faster. So they're the first ones to really build the big cities and, build, get into like, you know, idol worship and large statues and basically falling away from God and becoming, all these groups of pagan, tribes and cultures that still to this day worship things other than the God of the Bible. And you see this with many other religions. Um, and then Shem was the one who we just talked about carried the covenant line. So the way that it breaks down here is the Aegeans, which is on the left here, the Iranians, because again, he spread wide, the Indians, the Huns, and the Chinese are all direct descendants from, all the way back as far as we can go. The son Japheth. They're all direct descendants that go back to that son. Now, that son was not cursed, he was blessed, but he wasn't the favored son. Shem was. So his people would go off and live decent lives, and they would be blessed or cursed based on how they lived, but they were essentially um, you know, uh, just out there in the world spreading and multiplying, and it would be hit or miss. Some would be blessed, some would be cursed, based on how they lived. But there was no covenant directly with them. Ham aired the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Amorites. So those ones there. And then in between these like um Mesopotamian cultures, which is a sort of a combination of the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Amorites, that whole geographical location, which is the Middle East, was Shem's family line, which was like ancient Mesopotamia, parts of ancient Mesopotamia, Assyria, and then eventually the Hebrews, which came out of that, which we talked about before, because we go down here to write about where the Hebrews branch off of, and it's exactly this. It's the Hittites, it's the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and that's sort of where everybody stemmed from, and that's the Hebrews right there. And that is Shem's family line, which branched off from these early civilizations that were embedded within these other cultures that were ruled by Ham's people, which that's why you see a lot of like battles and strife in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, is, because you had like Shem's family who went to Canaan eventually at some point with Abraham. Um, and they were living among the Canaanites who were the children of Ham, who was the cursed one. And they were, you know, there was strife and differences and things like that. Like there's a story in, Genesis about how Abraham was called to, go to Canaan, and then he went to Egypt at one point, and he, had a wife, his wife Sarah, who was beautiful, but she couldn't conceive. So he was afraid that, the Egyptians, when they went to Egypt, the Pharaoh would, take his wife because she was beautiful, so and kill him. So he told them, "Say that you're my sister," and he told her, "Say that you're my sister, and they'll, respect me and treat me right because they'll honor you for being so beautiful, and they'll all desire you, but they won't kill me because I'm your brother," you know? And so he did that, and then the Pharaoh, found out it was all this stuff. But basically, like, they had to, they were embedded in, Shem's family line, which at that time was Abraham, was embedded in the land of Ham's family line, who they're all related at some level when you go all the way back to the top. But they had, differences culturally, religiously. They didn't believe in the same God, and things were so fractured that, they were just living completely different lifestyles. But they, somehow were able to coexist and live amongst each other. And God would move people around. God would tell people, leave here, run, flee from there. Exodus is a big example of that. Um, but yeah, so eventually, exactly, how I painted it is pretty much what it was, is Noah's sons repopulated the earth, and this is how they split up in the world. And then you have, all of these cultures sort of go throughout time and branch off into these different things that, birthed all these other civilizations until you get all the way down to the modern day, which is what we know today, which is, all the continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, all these major continents. But if you look at, the geographical locations of all these and where they came from, it's really quite interesting that you know, all of these different types of people, all the different cultures in the world, all the different races and how we all look different and sound different. And, obviously that came from like the Tower of Babel and that whole story in Genesis as well. But yeah, everybody got split up and spread across the earth. But people are all so different looking and so different sounding and so different, in many ways, yet we're all related to the same people. We all stem back to Noah and his family. So it's really quite interesting. And, even further back than that, we go back to Adam and Eve, but, um, you know, some of those people are no longer on earth, any of their descendants, because they were wiped out with the flood. But all of us go back to Noah's family because there was no other major thing that cut off the bloodline in between Noah and now because God said he'd never flood the earth again. So he never destroyed the entire earth again after Noah. Noah was the first time. I mean the last time that this happened. So everybody that's here today is related to each other at some level when you trace us all the way back to these siblings, the sons of Noah. So that's pretty much the breakdown. It's really, a lot, deeper than that. And there's so much to unpack in it that you really can't go through it all in even a few hours. But I just wanted to give you an overview and, sort of illustrate that we really all do just go back to the family of Noah. And we are all related, even though we're spread all throughout the world, at some level. That's why, like, now they're coming out with genetic testing, like 23andMe and all these other things. And people are finding out that they have so many more different cultural things in their genetics than they were told. Like their parents might have told them, "Oh, you're Irish or you're Italian or you're, Puerto Rican or whatever it is." And then they go do a genetic test and they have like, completely different cultures, genetics in their genetics. And they're thinking like, well, how could this be possible? Either these tests are wrong or we all have the same things in us because we're all related at some level, and that's really what it is. It's just the genetic tests are verifying what I'm saying here is that we all do go back to the same families of people, and they were all spread and split up throughout the earth. And this is where everything broke down from. So really, just the understanding is, you know, realizing that the story of Noah and the flood is real and that is a real story and that involved God, obviously, but it involved those people for a reason because they were part of the um, people that God would have repopulate the earth, and then Israel and the Hebrews and all that stuff came out of the son that was blessed by God and that God made the covenant with. And then that led to Abraham and that led to Isaac and that led to Jacob. And that eventually led to, way down the line, Jesus, was a descendant of Abraham. He was actually part of that genetic line. He was part of the blessed family line that goes back to Noah, right? And then Jesus, went on to establish Christianity because of his life, not because he came to, give us a religion. He just established it because he gave us the context of which to follow with the guidelines and the rules of life. And we made it into a document that is easy for us to comprehend as people, and that's, the New Testament and Christianity. And so, we all the Christians are, born again in spirit and part of that family, but some people may actually be part of that genetic bloodline that goes back to Jesus himself and also, the man Jesus, and also Noah's family line that goes back to his son Shem. So it's really quite interesting. Everything connects, and we are all one in God's eyes in terms of being His children. But also, spiritually as well. If you're a Christian, if you're not, you can, even if you're part of one of these other genetic lines, you could become a Christian still. Doesn't mean you're cursed for life and you have to stay that way. It means that, the curse was put on this family, but you can be free of it through Christ who came and said all this. He changed the game for the other two sons, by the way, to where all of their heirs can be saved as well. And they could all live as Christians and be free of the curse that was put on them, Ham, especially his genetic line. But it's quite interesting, and it's interesting to see how some cultures today, because you look at the ones that Ham, his family were the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Amorites, which, were the Babylonians and the Phoenicians and all these other people. And look at what groups of people those are today in society, what countries, what, cultures, civilizations. And you might understand more why they are in the situation they're in, whether it's poverty, whether it's the gods that they worship, or the culture, what the culture is in that country. Look and see, maybe some of it goes back to they're descendants of Ham, the son that was cursed. And the only way to get away from that is to be Christians and be born again and accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And then the curse of Ham will be lifted off of you and your people in your nation. So that's my theory, but it's based on what's in the Bible. So I'm not just making it up randomly, and it's not just some conspiracy that's online. This could all be traced back in the Bible. Go read Genesis. It breaks it all down for everybody, and it even lays out the people and the lineage and everything in real detail. But yeah, uh, really interesting, and non-biblical pieces of evidence like this corroborate and back that up. So yeah, it is quite interesting, and there's a lot more to that. So in the past, we you know explained the story of Noah, and then where the real hard evidence for it might be in Mount Ararat. Then we sort of connected, Göbekli Tepe to that, and that might have also been, Noah as well. And now we're connecting Noah and his family to the entire world, essentially, and how it encompasses every culture and civilization that's here today, where it all came from. So hopefully nobody else on the internet is doing this. Hopefully nobody else on the internet has connected all these dots. And obviously there's a lot more to go into it. It's not like I did everything perfect. And I didn't do most of this work. I didn't put this histomap together or anything. I just did the research that connects it all, and also reading the Bible. But hopefully we're giving you something different here on this channel. Hopefully we're bringing, a much more interesting perspective and a bigger picture, which is that mosaic of the internet that I was talking about, of sort of connecting all the dots and making you realize that, life is more than just the way that we live. And it's bigger than just, you know, the stuff that we do every day. Sitting around on social media and scrolling or playing video games, or, doing a lot of the things that people do in this world that waste their time, when there's so many other things that you could dive into and learn and use your brain and entertain. And a lot of people are always trying to entertain themselves. There's plenty of ways to find entertainment in stuff like this, or even just in the Bible. But hopefully it brought a different perspective, and it piques your curiosity into maybe looking at things in a different way, especially maybe looking at things in a different way, especially um, how we view other people. God says, love your neighbor as yourself. Maybe this will give you the understanding that we all come from the same people. We're all part of the same family. So there's really no reason to have strife or hatred or whatever. Yeah, there's a time for everything. And it says that in the Bible too. Even war, there's a time for war as well. But hopefully this helps people just in whatever way it does. I don't know. This is what I felt led to talk about and do. So that's what I did. But yeah, hopefully this paints a bigger picture and makes you realize that life is a lot bigger than our small little worlds and little circles, and the mindsets that we're in, most of the time. But that's it for this video. Don't forget to Like I always say, like, follow, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. If you found the content interesting, definitely share it with people who might find this interesting as well. If there's topics, that you want us to, cover on here, definitely, feel free to put in the comment section after each episode. And, you could even DM me directly if there's something specific you want me to talk about. Also, if you have any recommendations for guests for the show, we're looking to do a lot of guests this year to, do interviews and introduce that whole thing. But we, are always open to suggestion because I want to, provide you guys content that you find interesting as well as me, not just me. So if there's, a guest that you're interested in for the show, let me know. Put in the comments, DM me, and I will be happy to look into it to see if it's a fit for this channel. But that is it for this. Don't forget to stay for the ad at the end of the video, at the end of the podcast, so you can, support the channel by purchasing some of the products. And yeah, that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next one.
All right, everybody, I just want to take a moment to promote my children's book. This is Little Boy Full of Love. That's me on the back. And this is a little sneak peek on the inside. It's a great book. It's a children's book. I actually wrote this for my son. And it's available right now on Amazon, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, Bookshop.org, and a lot of other online platforms. But more importantly to me, it's actually available in a lot of bookstores throughout the country. You can find out which ones are closest to you on my Instagram page. We highly recommend that you shop local, buy from a local bookstore. So if you are looking to, get a children's book for you or anybody you know, or even with the holidays coming up, it's a great time to, buy a children's book as a gift. Definitely get it from a bookstore that's local to you. But if you absolutely can't get it from one of the bookstores that are currently carrying it right now, and we're in about 15 or 16 different states across the country, so it may actually be in your state, and it could even be local to you. But if you can't get it from the physical bookstore, check out our Amazon storefront. The book's available on there right now. And like I said, with the holidays coming up, you may want to do your Christmas or Hanukkah or holiday shopping early, and you can even order it from our Amazon storefront and ship it directly to whoever you're gifting it to. But it's available on those platforms, Amazon storefront and bookstores and other websites that I mentioned. But I want to take a moment here to look at the storefront just to give you an idea of some other stuff that we have available on there. These are products that we highly recommend. They are things that we use in our daily lives, and it's all organized by category. So it's a lot easier to, shop for the holidays and specifically for things that interest you, particular categories. Available right now, many different items on our storefront. If you can see here, 61 items just in women's apparel, fall decor, because right now we're in fall, 26 items, kitchen items, baking specifically, things for around the house, children's toys, even stuff for parties. If you're trying to save money on a party and throwing your own, occasion, you can even buy some cool gadgets here to help you, put on a better party. Health and wellness items here, even stuff for Christmas. And there's the book right there. So you can get it from the storefront. You can get it from the bookstores, like I mentioned. But it's available on all these different platforms. It's really easy to find and gift to somebody. Also, I want to show you the apparel shop, and these are some clothing items that we actually produced. So if you're looking to get some cool apparel items, shirts, hoodies, long sleeve, short sleeve, leggings, even accessories, cell phone cases, women's makeup bags, fanny packs, coffee mugs, all different types of stuff, even some, art, all different categories here, apparel, homeware, accessories, drinks, even digital items. It's all on this store, healthybodygoodssoul.com. Anything that pertains to you or somebody that you're looking to get a gift for the holidays. A lot of great designs on here, a lot of cool designs that we actually custom created. Stainless steel water bottles, especially now with the fall and winter. A lot of cool hoodies. and long sleeve shirts. This is a really cool one, I think, for women. The original Be Your Soul apparel, that one's actually really popular. People tend to like that. This one's one of my favorites. The free shirt. It's the American flag, and it says free, and that says not property of the United States government. That one's pretty cool. Got all different types of tank tops, hoodies, long sleeve, short sleeve, tote bags, coffee mugs, even some items for kids, backpacks. So if you're the type that likes to, plan ahead, I would definitely recommend ordering from the Amazon storefront or the apparel shop within the next couple of weeks to get everything in time for the holidays. Use code SAVE15 on the apparel shop to save 15% off everything on the storefront. So order within the next week or two, and you'll definitely have everything in time for the holidays. Definitely check out all the links to everything, the Amazon storefront, the book, and the apparel shop in my bio on all my platforms: Rumble, YouTube, Instagram, Spotify. But you can also find them in all the show notes for every episode that I post, and get all your orders in time for the holidays. All right, that's it for this video. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. It helps the channel continue to grow. And put in the comments things that you would like me to talk about and make videos on for the future, and I will definitely do my best to do that. Stay tuned for the next one.